everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Oh, hey there, Rob. It's me, Jackie McDonald, not Perry Cruz.
Hi, and it's me, Diana Perry Cruz.
Oh, thank you.
How are you, Rob?
I'm doing fine. Oh, do you have a segue to start us off?
No, well, only that Jackie and I have been walking down memory lane, reading past transcripts, and we used to ask each other how we were.
That's true.
You know,
we never do that anymore.
We never just talk
anymore. We don't talk.
We don't just talk. We just like sit and talk. Okay, so how are you guys?
Oh, fine.
How are you all? Sorry.
Fine. How are you?
We got some ice dam issues, so it's pretty cold. How about you, Jackie? How are you?
I am doing better than you all since I don't have a hole in my ceiling, so I'm winning over here.
That's good.
Yep.
That is good.
Totes. But guess what? We're not alone today.
No.
We have a guest.
We do have a guest.
I love that we're not alone today.
Before we introduce the guest, we should make sure everyone knows this is not a home improvement podcast because that's the last you'll hear about the ceiling. It's a podcast about, we'll see, about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and discuss it at length. And I don't believe we have like Bob Vila on the line to talk about home improvement. We're talking about a much more relevant to our field topic, which is what we like to do here. And that is Down syndrome and ABA. And to do that, we have a very special guest who's written and practiced on the subject, Dr. Kathleen Feeley. Kathleen, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So question number one, what do I do with this hole in my roof?
Wait, on the side,
these damn ice dams.
Right? As an aside, I do want you to know that I used to have a super crush on Bob Vila.
That's right.
Like so bad. And so every Saturday morning, me and my dad would watch Bob Vila home improvement shows, but I would watch it because I thought he was so cute, and my dad would watch it for information. So there you go, young Jackie. And I also wanted to put out that this episode was a Regis College graduate request.
It was, yes.
Thank you, Morgan.
From Morgan.
Yeah, Morgan sent us an email and said, hey, everyone, now that Massachusetts allows us to bill insurance for behavior analytic therapy for people with Down syndrome, what do I do? Where do I get the information? And so that is why we decided to do this episode, because we've not done it before and we don't know anything about it.
Well, speak for yourself. I know a little bit, but not enough to do a whole episode. That's why we have Kathleen here. She's the expert. So, Kathleen, how did you become the expert? Please, we'd love to hear more about your kind of, professional journey.
So I started my career as a New York City Department of Education classroom teacher. Very excited about that. One of my most proudest accomplishments. While I was teaching in the New York City Department of Ed, I was working with many children who didn't speak. And they had at the time, very progressive AAC program where they were giving students augmentative communication devices. And that was in the late 80s. So I was 22, 23, and started looking into doctoral programs for AAC. And I was in New York City area at the time, and couldn't study in AAC in programs in the Northeast because it was under speech pathology. But the Midwest was incredibly progressive in terms of letting you do cross study, so that at the University of Minnesota, where I actually ultimately went, you could be an education doctoral student, but study with individuals and communication disorders. So Dr. Joe Richley was there, and I interviewed with him over the telephone at the time, and then flew out and enrolled in the doctoral program at the University of Minnesota. And there were a lot of behavior analysts there. So this was pre-BCBA days.
Right, yeah.
And so my whole area of study was behavioral oriented, although I don't ever think I took a course on applied behavior analysis. But my dissertation looked at generalization gradients in learners. So I think I'm a certified behavior analyst because of that.
I always think about the rats in the noses, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
That's the generalization gradient, right? Yep.
Yeah, and colors and pigeons, where pigeons tap when they're taught to tap bread, where they stop tapping.
That's fascinating.
It was absolutely fascinating. And then, so we did a study with preschoolers with intellectual disabilities looking at generalization gradients with requesting. So that was dissertation. I came back to New York and was really challenged by the extent to which we segregate children with disabilities, and particularly in this region. It's mind-boggling. It was in 1995 when I returned, and it continues to be really mind-boggling. With that said, I opened a center. My colleague, Kathleen Feeley, and I pursued a lot of external funding and have technical assistance centers, regional technical assistance centers from New York State Education Department to make change. So that's what led me right here. In the world of applied behavior analysis and Down syndrome, I opened a program for young children with autism, and then was asked by a gentleman to start to think about other populations on Long Island that could benefit from applied behavior analysis, decided on Down syndrome, and here we are.
Excellent.
That was a lot, right? Sorry.
There was a second where I almost thought you were going to say I was going to get my doctoral dissertation in AAC, but there was like a typo or something, and it just put ABA instead, and I just got stuck.
No, I studied with a gentleman who was an applied behavior analyst and an AAC specialist. So, yeah.
Beautiful. So I think, Kathleen, when we talk about working with different populations, different levels of competence, certainly I don't want to speak for Jackie and Diana, but when I started getting into the field and I started learning about behavior analysis, my knee-jerk reaction was like, all human organisms will benefit from this, and I learned to do it with this population. Therefore, it's going to be true for everybody. But I think in looking at the works you have and some of my own experiences, some of them by, overgeneralizing what I thought I knew.
Thought stimulus control.
Yeah, that's not exactly the case. Would you mind, I'd love to kind of start our conversation off by talking a little bit about some of the differences in terms of, the behavioral phenotype that comes up in working with children with Down syndrome that you sort of had to, study more about or think about or put into your treatment plans. Because even though the principles are true to all humans, it doesn't mean that we can apply them exactly the same way across disability categories and expect the exact same results.
Right. So key areas, definitely motivating operations, really thinking about what you need to keep in mind when you're working with individuals with Down syndrome. And that really goes into several areas. One being medical complications that kind of go hand in hand with Down syndrome. So increased incidence of hearing impairment, visual impairment, right? Cardiac issues that really are life-threatening early on. So changes really I believe the dynamics when you have a baby that has all of these issues and then they make it. So sometimes it might change the way we interact with that child because of those confounding things, like it's a miracle that they survived. And so a little bit of that, and then increased likelihood for upper respiratory infections. Right? And a lot of this is just my decades of working with so many kids with Down syndrome, right? But, getting a cold and having it for a long time. So not necessarily just coming and going within a week, but kind of lingering. So all of those things play into how effective your treatment's going to be and how impactful your reinforcers are. So definitely keeping in mind medications that they're on, low muscle tone, the intestines are a muscle, right? You might not have regular bowel movements, and that's going to impact kids. So that's one whole piece, that whole medical. There's medical practice guidelines that anyone who works with children with Down syndrome should really take a very good look at. So that's one area. And then it's that behavioral phenotype, right? That increased likelihood of desiring attention and just wanting lots and lots of attention. And we've known that forever about kids with Down syndrome, how social they are, and a social strength. So when you're thinking about reinforcers, pairing them up with the social reinforcer is probably going to be really impactful. Also, strong desire to escape difficult tasks, right? They're not going at a task the way a typical learner would, even in very young ages, avoiding things that are just slightly more difficult. So what seems could be just this easy thing to ask a student, if the student has Down syndrome, it might be a little bit more difficult, and therefore they may react quite drastically because so the value to escape that activity is really high. So I think those are the ways that we should know about Down syndrome before we try to, change a lot about them.
Mm-hmm. I think, Kelly, one of the things I'm always struck by when either I'm speaking to individuals who either work with individuals with Down syndrome or parents of children with Down syndrome, or when I've sort of read up on various materials I sent, is how it seems just everyone's kind of fast and loose with referring to kids with Down syndrome as, oh, they're stubborn. They're so stubborn. Is that just one of those weird social, like it's just been allowed for so long, or it's just such a part of the behavioral phenotype that everyone kind of just shrugs and uses that term? Or is that just something that's kind of falling out of favor? Because I know it was mentioned in the studies as like this keeps coming up, and you put it in quotes because it's not it's not great to refer to any group as any sort of type. But I just was sort of struck by that. Is it because it's because there's a chromosomal piece to some of this that people feel more comfortable throwing these wide net descriptor terms?
So probably, right? And it's probably been there as long as, Down syndrome has been called Down syndrome based on Langdon Down's observation of individuals and identifying a whole bunch of kids that looked the same and also said they acted the same. So I think it's just this long history of doing that. There's also in individual students a long history of getting a lot of social attention for being non-compliant. Mm-hmm. Right? Because if you ask me to do something and you walk away, well, if I throw myself on the floor and stamp my feet, then chances are you're going to come back. You're going to look at me. You're going to bend down. You're going to coax me up. You're going to maybe carry me, which is we see a lot of, more than we'd like. And oh boy, it pays off to be stubborn in that quote unquote instance. So yes. Right,
we do be sort of a more easily operantly shaped behavior given the increased value of the social attention.
Yes, absolutely. But then their desire to not want to do things, right, that are slightly more difficult. So then you may see an increase in that behavior. So you probably see it a little bit more. Right? But certainly not in all kids. And that the key about a behavioral phenotype is there's an increased likelihood. It doesn't mean you'll see it in everybody.
That's exactly what I was just about to say, is that I'm sure that there is quite a range. Oops, I hit the microphone. Super professional. quite a range within individuals with Down syndrome, how likely you are to see some of these behavioral presentations.
Right. And we know that there are children with Down syndrome that have and adults who do not have any intellectual disability whatsoever. So, they may not be stubborn.
Yeah. So, Kathleen, one of the things that I'm always surprised when I'm, reading about, various behavioral treatments, behavioral interventions, is how often there's a sense of, well, there's got to be so much research. And if there are behavior problems and there are these known motivating operations, whether they're called motivating operations or setting events or just patterns, whatever it might be, there's this sense of, well, of course, there's going to be tons of research, probably much of it using things like behavior analysis, or at the very least, like basic behavior modification type techniques. And you mentioned a lot in your studies of there just aren't a lot of really strong empirical studies for behavioral interventions. What's going on there that this is sort of a known pattern that could occur in a population that it's just, well, let's not write about it. We'll just do stuff. What's happening there?
Well, there was early on, right? So your early studies demonstrating the principles of behavior analysis on human beings, there was a different word that was used then. You can find that word in those studies, mongoloid, and you can find early work that was really the first work with individuals, with humans, right? And applied behavior analysis. So there's a few early on. Then for Down syndrome in particular, the research, people that were specializing in conducting research with children with Down syndrome were more focused on demonstrating how similar they were to typically developing individuals. So there's a huge amount of literature really focusing on the strengths of people with Down syndrome and all the wonderful things that they can do. And that's amazing, right? But what fell apart was that treatment for them, and there wasn't a whole lot of it. There was early work that was placed in a manual about behavioral treatment and was published in a book, and it got a little leverage. And then, interestingly enough, New York State Department of Health issued guidelines for early intervention for different disabilities. And those for autism really went viral, and even in other parts of the world. And Down syndrome, whoever wrote it, right, they didn't talk about applied behavior analysis in there. They talked about operant learning, and it just didn't get the attention that, so we're being a New Yorker, right, we're pulling all those up and we're saying, hey, look at this. These are the guidelines for early intervention. It says it right here, and multiple teaching opportunities and close proximity, but it really didn't get a whole lot of attention. So one of the things that Emily Jones, my colleague, and I did is we hand searched the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, because if you just did a word search and one learner had Down syndrome, it was in a table and it wouldn't come up. But if you took a good look at every study and the participant tables, then you would find there were a lot of participants who had Down syndrome that were in a lot of researchers' studies, but it was just looking at intellectual disability or developmental disability as a whole. So it's there. And interestingly enough, based on what you had mentioned, Massachusetts, an agency there reached out to us to help train their behavior analysts, which we're very excited to do. And I'm just doing some research with an amazing young woman, Eilish O'Connell Sussman, who just got her PhD in applied behavior analysis. And we just started to continue those hand searches actually today, having our students at Long Island University going through the tables in intervention studies. So long answer to your question, but
it's kind of that history and branding and all the things that, kind of a problem, baby.
I was going to say it's a lot of work, but some graduate students got to do it.
Oh, going through tables. Yeah.
Well, I did it.
I did it too.
I know it too.
Right. And I didn't pass being a doctoral student. But
one thing I realize people might want to do after they listen to this episode is look at some of the research, and we haven't actually, that's my bad. Diana, would you mind sharing what articles will be this is a good segue because we're going to talk more in depth about the articles.
Sure. I realized that, I think, at the same moment that you did, is that we hadn't reviewed what they are.
Well, you started the segue. Usually I start the segue. We're all off. We're all off.
Okay. So we have 3 articles that will be sort of background reading for our discussion today, and they include Addressing Challenging Behavior in Children with Down Syndrome, the Use of Applied Behavior Analysis for Assessment and Intervention by Feeley and Jones. That was published in Down Syndrome Research and Practice 2006. Also, Strategies to Address Challenging Behavior in Young Children with Down Syndrome by Feeley and Jones, and published in Down Syndrome Research and Practice 2008. And finally, Advancing Imitation and Requesting Skills in Toddlers with Down Syndrome by Feeley, Jones, Blackburn, and Bauer. And that was in Research and Developmental Disabilities, 2011.
So, Kathleen, I'd love to kind of jump into some of the article with your case studies, because I think that really nicely captures a lot of the questions that, kind of our listeners have given us. And I think we always have sort of, hey, I get the principles, which you lay out really, really well. I really love,
great article.
when I see, I'm kind of, whether it's from a different field or whether it's just for a different population, I love seeing how people sort of describe behavior analysis to an audience that hasn't studied behavior analysis. Here are the key components, which, it's setting events, it's antecedent control, it's, your prompting, it's your reinforcement, right? Just putting it all out there really nicely. But I think what would help is I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the kind of interventions, case studies. We don't have to get into exact detail of each one, but really looking at, through your career, through your work with others and training, sort of what are some of the markers of working with an individual with Down syndrome that folks who may have experience using ABA techniques with, say, either typically developing children or children with autism, that they really should be taking into account for the specific needs of a child with Down syndrome. Like, what should they be doing? What could they do right? What might they do wrong?
Right. So realizing that many children with Down syndrome are both attention motivated and escape motivated. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's the student that tries to elope, but goes to the doorway and then looks back to make sure someone's chasing them. If no one's chasing them, they stay right where they are because they'll get more attention for staying, right? But if someone's chasing them, out the door they go. And I think that's really one of the key areas to address, is that attention motivated behavior that's probably also escape maintained, right? So also thinking about how effective antecedent strategies are. And we don't see a lot of antecedent-based strategies when we're looking at, for example, behavior support plans, right? We see a lot of reinforcement strategies being used. And lots of times it's just switching up the antecedent that is incredibly effective for children and spouses and everybody, right? How you ask a child or a person to do something could make the world of difference. So I think that is really key. Pre-specifying the reinforcer or collaboration, offer of collaboration, because that inherent in collaboration is attention, right? So we kind of know those are going to be incredibly effective, or a high probability request sequence, because you're getting all that feedback and then they want to continue that social interaction. So those antecedent strategies are really impactful. So are just basic functional communication training and realizing, getting clinicians to realize that they need to prompt it before the prompt behavior, not after, right? So it's one thing to write up a plan and hand it over, and then it's a very different thing to go into the classroom or into the home and model it. And I would definitely say that's just best practice, but really impactful. Also, the way we respond if there's an error. I think that for children with Down syndrome, one of the most impactful ways to respond is not to respond or just to turn away after a problem behavior occurs, because any type of interaction is going to be reinforcing. So close proximity, eye contact. And we see a lot of that clinically, telling the child what they did wrong and trying to fix it. And so really just turning away. And even so there's lots of components here. So one, addressing problem behavior, but what Emily Jones and I have laid out is how to use those principles just to teach skills, any skills, self-care skills, toileting skills, cognitive skills. And it's very much built into intervention in that way, so that your consequence isn't try again or it's just really turning one's head. And that sometimes isn't very palatable to interventionists, but what we've found is families are like, oh yeah, if it works, we'll do it. And so, parents don't have an advisor or academic necessarily people to be accountable to, so why they can't do something, so it's been really nice working in homes with families. But so definitely how you consecrate would be really strongly impactful in terms of not having it have attention linked to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting.
One piece I really loved, kind of going back to talking about antecedent strategies, I think you laid out so nicely the home to school log as an example of an antecedent strategy in that study, that of just knowing what could be going on outside of school and just shifting programming slightly in the day, just being such a huge kind of sea change in terms of, and it's going to be a great day now. Do you mind talking a little bit about kind of, how one might develop those, or sort of what are some of the key areas you might want to be thinking of in terms of creating that log?
Yeah. So anytime I do a training, I learn more from my participants, right? So we do a lot of work in schools. And so we had this teacher say, well, at parent-teacher open school night, when all the parents come, I give handle with care passes. And every parent gets 5 or 6 handle with care passes. And if they have had a rough night at home with their spouse or their child in the morning, the child can come into class with a handle with care pass. And there goes the log, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't even need that. But with the log, it would be great, right? If people read it and note it. And you don't even have to say what it is. Right? You don't have to say, well, we were up late because my high schooler did blah, 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 right? It's just, Charlie didn't sleep well.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be a rough one.
Yeah. And, teaching assistants, in my experience, they know, right? They'll say, oh, that kid had a look in his eye, right? And many naturally change the way they interact with that person. But we just need it more globally done, right? And then and understanding that if that happens, what can you do? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's just feeding the child a little snack, right? If they miss breakfast, or having them just put their head down on the desk for 15 minutes and take a little cat nap. And then sometimes it's just giving lots of reinforcement for the first 10 minutes of the day. And then all those things disappear. So it's also getting people to understand the value of it. And that's sometimes hard. And then the value of realizing that some families just don't have the time to report. So is there another way? Can it be a text or a phone call or a handle with care pass?
Mm, I like that idea. Just hey, here it is. Switch to it's education plan B today.
Right,
do the educational games, not the educational drill and drills, something like that.
Exactly.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA, also known as a board certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
Hey everyone, sorry for pausing the episode, but I want to remind all of our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to this episode, you're able to earn one either dual diagnosis CEU or one learning CEU, depending on which body you're working under. And to get those, whatever the CE is going to be, you're going to need to click the link in the podcast player or go to ABA Inside Track and go to this episode. You're going to need to know some key information about our episode, information that you have learned, as well as 2 secret code words that we're going to put in, one right here and one a little bit later. And these are secret guest code words from Dr. Feeley. The first is SCARF, SCARF. Now, you might think, oh, it's like when I shove a bunch of food in my face. No, you're wrong. It's the one that you put around your neck. Dr. Feeley was very clear about this when we were talking about it.
Yeah.
So we'll know if you meant the one where you stick the food in your mouth. We'll figure it out, even though they're spelled the same. We'll just know, and you won't get credit. So make sure you're writing the scarf that you put on your neck. All right. Anyway, let's get back to the episode, shall we?
I really just loved the whole context of the positive behavior support plan and the way that it is laid out in here. I don't know if I had seen it laid out like just so clearly as it was here. So everyone should like pop over to take a look at just the arrangement of it.
It's really nice.
Yeah, like I spend a lot of time with my students talking about how important the antecedent side is, because the consequence side, independent of anyone's, diagnosis, if we're dealing with some type of challenging behavior, then we have some things that we can do consequently, but they're limited, really, right? And especially as you're saying, if we're worried about potentially, building larger repertoires of attention maintained behavior, right? Then we may be kind of limited in what we can do there. But this breaks down for us like 3 different areas that kind of fall on the antecedent side. So it's looking at those setting events, like you said. So what might be the background likelihood of behavior occurring due to any number of capacities, the in the moment antecedent strategies, so like choice making opportunities that could be presented, and then skill building strategies as well. So making sure we're building in FCR opportunities, et cetera. Like all of that is so great, because you're not getting into those like tricky, consequent areas at all. It's all about setting someone up for success, really. And I just loved the way it was broken down. It would be such a great exercise to like provide to your BTs or your teachers, and having them like fill in what goes in each of these components. So everybody go check this one out.
Yeah. And O'Neill and Horner's early functional behavior assessment book, that maybe before your time, but it was maybe hard-covered navy blue book, and now it became a manual with a green soft cover. It was one of the first things I studied at the University of Minnesota in my doctoral program, and a very, very intricate way of doing a functional assessment observation, which I still use. So yeah, it's kind of laid out there as well. And if you look at state regulations for implementation of the FBA and BIPs, at least New York State is pretty closely tied to that. And so, yeah, it's a great model. Make sure you check all of those boxes.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know. I mean, we've talked about PBIS before, but I just, sometimes things just come to you, and in that moment, you're like, this is the one. That's just how I felt about this. Yeah. That's how I felt about figure 3 on page 159.
Kathleen, another, kind of, we talked a little more about antecedents. We're going to talk about, I want to talk about skill acquisition, because certainly you have a whole paper on some like really clever and really thoughtful ways to do scope and sequence for skill acquisition. But kind of going back to consequences, you mentioned sort of what's the correction procedure, how you might want to make it different for a child with Down syndrome due to the potency of the attention. But you also brought up in the study the idea that a lot of times adults will really infantilize children with Down syndrome. And I've certainly seen that with a lot of students across, with or without disabilities. But there is that sense of a lot of times children with Down syndrome will do something, and everyone's response is like, "Oh, you're being so naughty. Let's make a big..." And I'm always like, why are we treating this problem behavior different in this context than we would for because any other time you'd be like, "That's not okay. We're going to do this, or let's move on." And why is this like a funny, hilarious show we're all enjoying? Do you have any tips for what to do when people do that? Because I've sort of given them that, "Hey, I think what you're doing is ridiculous" statement. Yeah. And it's not
it's an ableist
received well.
Practice.
It's very ableist. Yeah. People don't like it when I tell them, "You're being ableist. Stop that." They don't like that. When I tell them, "This isn't effective. You're being ridiculous." They don't like that. What should I have done instead?
So it reminds me of a young child with Down syndrome who was pulling hair. Right. Mm-hmm. And he was about 3 years old, and we had a lot of parent training projects. So we were training the grandparents, actually. And so it's really important that when Matthew pulls hair, you don't give him all of this attention and like, "Oh, it doesn't hurt so bad." And I knew from being in this family's home that they had a next door neighbor who was the same age as Matthew. So I just said to the grandparents, "Well, what if Charlie walked in and pulled your hair like that?" And right away it was like, "Oh no, he would never do that. He knows better than that." Same age, same birth month, right? But, and I think that's the best way to draw people's attention to it, is that this child's age is 6, 7, 5, 14, 23. Therefore, let's look at all of the 23 or kids, that are that age, and are they doing it? And then let's really be thinking about how we could change this behavior for this child. I think that's one of the best ways. Also, I'm a huge proponent of inclusive education. So we see less of that in inclusive settings because there's a lot of people in that environment who will say, no way, he can't do that. No one else is coming off the line from kindergarten to give their last year's teacher a big hug and a kiss. But, so once a child's included and there's this understanding that the same expectations should be on that child, is particularly social expectations than the rest of the class, then that's a way to handle it. And then one of the things we noticed is, and I don't know if there's any research on this, but children engage in motherese as well. So
yes, I have seen that firsthand, and it's like the same, almost as hard as with the adults of like, no, your response is making this where it's confusing how you're responding to these things you say you don't like, but you look like you're having a great time when your hair gets pulled.
Right. So one of the things that we do in classes with children is we find the one kid that doesn't do that. It doesn't speak to the child like a baby. And then we make a huge deal out of that so that everybody knows that's who they should be emulating, is the kid that just walks in and says, yo, what's up? Right? Now, did you have fun last night? And it's like, when a fifth grader says that to another fifth grader, it's a little odd. So we've been doing a lot of reinforcing of kids that just treat the child, like a same age peer.
So you look for your models in the environment, or you have environments that tend to want. I never thought I'd be excited to be like, oh, Ray, it's a teacher that's like, no, I'm consistent and I have the same expectations for everyone. But you know what? Sometimes it sounds like it's actually a benefit.
Well, for behavior, yes. Academics, for some kids with Down syndrome, we need a little leeway there. And that's not always so easy, but we're getting there.
Maybe that's a good segue to talk a little bit more about skill acquisition. So I know that you put together in the 2011 article just a really great scope and sequence for teaching language, requesting skills. But I did want to sort of pull out one part of that in specifically talking about some of the prompting strategies. You mentioned in terms of like error correction, trying to minimize the amount of attention given as like, that's not the right answer. And I think it was pretty clear, just kind of the turn away, turn back, present the correction trial. But you also had used, especially for language development, some physical prompts. I'd love to sort of hear how you determined those. Like, did that come from sort of your background working a lot with speech and language and AAC? Are those ones that you would recommend behavior analysts learn more about, or more that's wait for your speech pathologist to help you out there? Like, how do those physical prompts come into play with the language acquisition?
So one thing, when we first started our work with children with Down syndrome, we had an early intervention program. So we had a handful of kids who were newborn, a handful of kids that were 1, handful of kids that were 2, handful of children that were 3. And that was amazing because at the same time, we got to see all these different ages. And we also looked at skill acquisition in typically developing children, right, to kind of model that off of. One of the things we told families right away is to desensitize their child to touching their lips, right, so that you could actually physically prompt a child really early on at 1 or 1.5, and they weren't adverse to it, so they didn't move away because they were used to their family, putting lotion or on their face and tapping. Is my favorite really early on when you put your hand up to your mouth. People aren't going to see me, and then we put our hand up to the children's mouths. So we did it simultaneous, us and them. And so that hand up on their mouth was actually a prompt to vocalize. Yeah. And we didn't have to put it all the way up. We could just raise it and they knew like, ah!
Yeah.
And it worked really well. Now, more recently, Eilish O'Connell-Sussman had a little bit of challenges in a recent study. Her dissertation actually is getting kids to respond to that. So it may not always work. It's not a fail-safe prompt, but it worked for the students that we had at the time. It worked really well, and we're still using it with lots and lots of kids. So that's one way, is to just establish that prompt so that you can get them to vocalize, so that when they vocalize, they can receive reinforcement. So that was one of the key areas that we did in terms of prompting. And then lots of visual prompts, right? I know just in general for kids with Down syndrome tend to be really good at understanding and remembering what they see. So using as many visual prompts as you can. And we also, there's a system called Prompt that SLPs know, where they prompt. And we worked with a speech therapist early on who was prompt certified, and she shared with us a few, but we've done some really idiosyncratic ones, like with a snake for the sound. And as soon as we would put our hand up with our two fingers together, the child right away would go, it's not a whole lot of problems with kids with Down syndrome generalizing their skills. I have to say, they're really good at generalizing it, but they definitely need that prompt in order to get it fully within their repertoire.
Okay. All right. Well, and speaking of kind of that overall sort of, the scope and sequence for requesting, I'd love to sort of just hear the genesis of that as an idea, because sometimes you read an article and you're like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. Use what a child is good at, use their strengths, and then build on that skill. That makes sense. But I don't, I know a lot of folks don't always think about teaching communication as what's the scope and sequence. So like, I don't know, it's all the same thing. Get a motivating operation, maybe do a couple mass trials, make sure that there's a reinforcer, potentially a tangible reinforcer paired with the natural reinforcer. Bing, there you go. That's how it works. And I think your scope and sequence really took advantage of what you knew about where are the most potent reinforcers for the students we're working with. So would you mind sort of like talking about how you developed that, sort of talk a little bit more about what it was and how you kind of taught those functional communication skills?
So for one study, when we were recruiting participants, and there was a school in this region for children with Down syndrome, and it was apparent that they all had the same speech therapist, because they would look at what they wanted and would sign more while looking at the item that they wanted, which is really interesting to see a child just look at something and sign more with no gaze shifting to other people in their environment, which is getting someone's attention and then looking back at what they want and then looking back, right? Kind of like joint attention, but it's a form of requesting.
Right, yeah.
So then just modeling what typical kids do, right? Which is they see something that they like, they find a communicative partner in which to request the item, and then they communicate to their partner, and then they're reinforced by delivery of that item. So that was really the skill sequence. And we knew that children, we could teach verbal imitation, right? And that's a core challenge with children with Down syndrome. They're really good at imitating what they see, but they're not very good at imitating what they hear. So our early work, and Emily Jones and I worked in an intensive behavioral treatment program for children with autism, ages 18 months to 3 years of age. And then a gentleman by the name of Mike Darcy asked us to kind of expand that work to other disabilities. So we did. And we did it with children with Down syndrome. And then we realized that even older children, 4, 5, 6, didn't have, and had lots of speech therapy, didn't have basic verbal imitation or vocal imitation skills at all. We've met elementary school students that didn't verbally imitate. Like, wow, that's just your basic skill. So let's just wind this back a bit and let's do some imitation training. So of course we do, do this, right? Gross motor imitation, then do this, and lo and behold, we were teaching 2-year-olds with Down syndrome to imitate, 18 months, to imitate what they heard. So now we have them vocalizing. We could prompt them because we desensitize them to the touch to get the whoosh to close. So it went from an ah to a and then lots of teaching opportunities, which is another thing that doesn't make sometimes applied behavioral analysis palatable, because there's a lot of folks saying, oh, it should be child-directed and not teacher-directed. And well, if you watch a typical child learn, they do the same thing over and over and over again, right? And I watch my own kids do that. Now I have a grandchild, and it's funny. He does the same thing over and over and over again, right? So we were able to work with interventionists to say, it's okay. You can take this one skill and you can do it again and again and again and again. And no one's going to get hurt. And we're not breaking any rules here. And it's an okay thing to do. So that was part of our treatment is, and we just truly did 10 because it was easy to get the percentage for success. There's no magic number.
I hear that. Yeah.
Can you shoot for this? And it was easy on a changing table in a high chair before and after a meal to gather, the child and sneak in 10 teaching opportunities. So we weren't doing 6 hours of discrete child training. Right. We were doing these intensive treatment, like a high dose, right, teaching opportunities. And that I think is huge for behavior analysts to understand, because look, we refer to it as context for instruction or the level of intensity of treatment. Lots of kids with Down syndrome are just going to learn because they're in circle time, right? If you're talking about preschoolers, they're going to pick up lots and lots of things, but there's lots of things they're not going to pick up that way. So really thinking about where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and can you increase the number of teaching opportunities for areas of weakness? And then lo and behold, that's what we did. And then we looked at typical skill sequences. And then I have to mention Deborah Fiddler's work. So she does a lot of work comparing different disabilities and identifying characteristics of behavioral phenotypes. So she would identify the weakness, and then Emily Jones and I would be like, I think we could fix this. If we increase teaching opportunities and break down the skill. And that's what led our work and continues to lead her work, because she's just doing fabulous things. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense how you came, and so you had the vocal imitation piece going along with the gaze shift to the requesting sort of the attention to the interaction before moving on to the more less social interaction, asking for help. I guess there's some social interaction there. And while I know you mentioned in the limitations that it wasn't you certainly weren't proving no one will learn to ask for help until they've learned to ask for the interaction. It did seem to kind of move the skill along relatively fast. And there was that sense of acceleration, especially with the vocal imitation of once they learned a few with the same procedures by like number 3, barring that one participant who had the kind of the mouth deformity or the mouth.
Right. The palate. She had a lot of
palate. Yes.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They were able to learn those skills and use them and maintain them too. The maintenance data was really great in that study.
Yeah. And generalization. We had another study where we taught a little guy to say bless you when someone sneezed, and he was the third of 4 boys, or the second of 4 boys, and his dad came in for a meeting and goes, I don't know what you're doing with this kid, but he's the only one in my house that says bless you. And so I think kind of the difference with other disabilities is children with Down syndrome want to communicate and want to be social. They don't necessarily have the skills sometimes, right? So when they have the skill, boy, they use it. So I think that's where there's a little difference. You don't have to concentrate too hard on those generalized behaviors, because once they get the skill, there's a lot of generalization. And we have the videotape of the mom doing the probes. The generalization probes, and her face says it all, because she taught the other skills and she did not teach that particular sound. And when she said E and the baby said E, it was really exciting.
That's really cool. And I just really appreciate this conversation that we're having, because I think a lot of students of behavior analysis are only learning about behavior analysis in the context of providing services to kids with autism. And the science of behavior is one thing, and then the application of it to assistance in a particular population is another. And everything that you're saying, it fits within the science of behavior, right? But it involves us needing to remind ourselves to zoom out, right? And our understanding of how behavior operates, or what our expectations should be with respect to, DTT or varying types of EOs, has often been colored by our experiences working with a particular subset of individuals. And those EOs, it's all about that setting event that you talked about, right? Like those EOs could be quite different for person to person, as well as, providing this additional like piece of background information. So we have to, zoom out and think about like, well, what are all the factors that may be relevant for working with this individual? And some of the assumptions that we could have about the EO that could be in place, it could be quite different depending on who we're working with. So I think that it would be fantastic for everyone to work with a variety of individuals from a variety of backgrounds, because some things that we're thinking are like, oh, I know how this is going to go. It might not go like that, right? And the more varied, as you know, like the more varied exemplars you get, the more that we can really distill that back down to our understanding of how behavior operates at its principle level. And then the application of that to different individuals we work with is going to be, more easily done, I think.
Yeah. I think an illustration that our personnel that were working with kids with autism, then we started a program for kids with Down syndrome and they switched them. It was quite different for them.
Yeah.
And then we had to let he just doesn't want to do this. And we're like, all right, then play with him.
Yeah.
Play a game and then embed it within the game. And it's okay. He's not in his chair. He could be sitting on the floor and change a lot of things. And then took data on just naturalistic teaching, just naturalistic learning opportunities. And kids were learning some things at a high rate just by sitting around with their typical peers. But then there were other things that they weren't learning. And that's where we needed to increase the intensity of instruction. So, yeah. Without removing them from the gen ed setting for their entire life.
Yeah.
So, Kathleen, have you seen more adoption of kind of ABA interventions in EI, in general education settings, special education settings, since some of these, like your publications in 2008, 2011? Has there been a shift there? Does it still kind of feel like you're constantly trying to convert people to like, no, there's a lot of good research. Come on, folks, let's change it up. Like, what's the status right now? At least in your scope, where where you're able to sort of see programs.
Yeah, I think on Long Island here, there is definitely a shift due to an advocacy organization, the Down Syndrome Advocacy Organization, that does a lot of trainings. And I've presented there, and Eilish has, and Emily has, Emily's students from Queens College. So there's a lot of information getting in the hands of our early interventionists and families to ask for it. So we do, particularly with Down syndrome, we do see that. And we're seeing more behavior analysts in our schools. Regionally here, and because New York State, a behavior analyst isn't a licensed professional that can work in the schools. So it's tricky. You need to be something else and be a behavior analyst. Oh, yeah. But I've done some work in the state of New Jersey where they have lots of behavior analysts and lots of kids are benefiting from behavioral interventions. So it's really kind of a mix. I'm not seeing as much as I would like to, but we did manualize this and we published it with a publisher that went out of business during COVID.
Oh, sad.
So, yeah, I think we published it in 2019 and then it went out.
Oh my God.
But Brooks Publishing, hopefully we're picking it up. So
we're sending vibes out. Good vibes.
We're hoping.
Brooks is a great publisher.
Yeah.
I always like what they publish. So I hope that gets picked up.
Yeah. So yes, I do believe we see an increase in it. I get a lot of people that reach out to me from all over the country and it's interesting because oftentimes it's a parent who is a BCBA or a parent who's a special ed teacher and then has a child and says, I really want my therapist to do this. I'm not seeing it in preparation programs, at least here regionally. They're still learning very, very different models of intervention that aren't necessarily evidence-based. Our early interventionists. So yeah, hopefully that's shifting.
Oh, Well, that seems like a
It
good.
rolls us right in.
That's what I was gonna say.
I just really want to preempt all of your segues
to dissemination
today.
station.
We're in a segue race, right? And my segue has pulled ahead
I think
of your
before we
segue.
started recording, I said, does anyone want to do some of these segues? And everyone says, no, Rob, you do it. It's fun. And then I'm cut out from under. Just
Because I've been watching a lot of Arrested Development. And
okay.
I got Job's segue on my mind.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's an old show
proceed.
for folks
Proceed.
out there.
Go right ahead.
Well, here we go. We've
Yay,
made it
we're
to
here.
Dissemination Station.
Right. So, Kathleen, I think there's kind of 2 points that I'd love to sort of, wrap up our conversation today. One would be similar, talking about practice programs. If you're a behavior analyst and you are either because, hey, that's who your clinic has, just as a family with a child with Down syndrome, so you need to learn right quick what to do, or if you are interested in moving more regularly into working with Down syndrome population, what would you say are the additional steps that are going to be really important to focus on in order to build that clinical competence?
Read our work. I think that is because there's not a lot of people talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think particularly more recently, Emily Jones, Nicole Neal, they are really sharing information, continuing to share information. So I think that is one thing. Getting a really good handle on the medical guidelines and knowing all of those pieces. I would spend a lot of time with families. That's really important. A student of Ted Carr's, so Ted Carr was right here in my backyard at Stony Brook University, and he had a student who finished after Ted passed away, and I was on her committee, and she wanted to look at relationships between parents of children with autism versus typically developing children. And she asked me to be on her committee, and I said, well, I will if you add a third group, children with Down syndrome families. And interestingly enough, the families of children with Down syndrome actually demonstrated better ties between the parents than the parents who are typically developing children. So I think that's really important, is to spend a lot of time with families and ask them what their hopes are, what their dreams are, what they can do, what they want their child to do, because they're the best teachers. We've had so much success teaching siblings how to run intensive interventions for articulation training. So they go to a pizza place and the child loves Sicilian pizza and can't say Sicilian. So his brother, who's 9, runs 10 opportunities at a time for a week. And before you know it, the kid's walking up to the counter saying, I'd like a slice of Sicilian. So I would definitely capitalize on those components. So medical guidelines, reading what's out there in behavioral, work with children with Down syndrome, learn about the behavioral phenotype. Deborah Fidler is a key place to find that information.
Okay.
Yeah. And then speak to any of us. Just reach out to us. We're happy to share information. So
I just loved how New York that example was.
I was going to say, like, we don't do the Sicilian pizza stuff. I don't know if we can do that in Massachusetts. I hope so, but... And Kathleen, just from a kind of like a research and practice standpoint, what's sort of next for iterating on sort of the process of improving EI, improving treatment outcomes in terms of research with children with Down syndrome or adults with Down syndrome for that matter?
Yeah. So historically when you had asked me why there wasn't a lot of research, I was thinking a lot about behavior analysis, but there wasn't a lot of money being dedicated to research for children with Down syndrome. And that changed fairly recently with a group of families from California who really pushed. And now NIH has its own funding line engaged to increase studies, because there was, I believe, from my sense and things that people have said to me, it's like, oh, isn't there a cure for that? Don't they have prenatal testing? Right.
Oh.
So thinking like, oh, we figured that out, but we haven't. Right. And it's still a very high incidence, 1 in 1,000 learners, live births, or children with Down syndrome. And so with that said, it would be really nice. And I wish that we did this, right? I wish we dedicated our careers to doing a really good controlled study, randomized with a group, match pairs and getting some intensive behavioral treatment and others. But it's out there with other populations, right? It's out there with autism. So that would be a great thing if someone could do that. I don't think I could do because I couldn't withhold treatment to a bunch of kids, right? So, but someone out there is probably really good at that. And the fields of implementation science, are you familiar with implementation science? Like, how do you get people to implement what we know works? And it's big in the medical field. We know this works. We know having children with disabilities alongside their typical peers is an effective intervention. We knew it in the 70s for preschoolers, yet we still rely on segregated systems, right? We know that reinforcement works. We know that functional communication works. So really shifting, how do we get preschool teachers that have had a completely different training, right, to adopt these interventions? And I think those are areas. And then also we've trying to shift it from behavior to communication skills, object manipulation, and concept attainment. So Emily's doing a great work in that area. So really looking at different areas of development that we could apply the same things, identify the skill sequence, break it up, and then use effective interventions to address the skills.
Excellent. Well, Kathleen, like you mentioned, hopefully the manual will be back in publication soon as a resource. In the meantime, if folks are interested in continuing their work, learning more about supporting children with Down syndrome, is there an email or a place that they could reach you, whether it's just to ask when the book's coming out again or when the manual's coming out again, or just to ask specific questions?
Sure. It's my first and last name with a dot in between. So Kathleen.Feeley, F as in Frank, EELEY at liu.edu.
Oh.
So right here.
Well, thank you. Dr. Kathleen Feeley, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciated this chance to talk with you about your work and to learn more about supporting this population of students.
Thank you.
One more time, we want to say a big thank you to Dr. Kathleen Feeley for coming on the show to talk to us all about working with children with Down syndrome. It's one of those topics that, when you hear about it and you discuss it with someone so knowledgeable, you say like, oh yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. But until you have that conversation and look at some of the research, there is that sense of like, I don't know if I know what to do. It might be so different, right? So I hope you all feel the same way and you're ready to learn more.
Exactly. That's what I was about to say. You could definitely learn more.
Well, I beat your segue that time, didn't I?
Because, we've dedicated many, many, many episodes to working with kids with autism.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is our first one that's dedicated to Down syndrome, but I bet there's more we could talk about.
I wish there were a way to know what other episodes we've done that have been kind of like similar topics. If there were like a section of the show called Pairings where we did something, but there isn't. So we're going to wrap up here. Oh, wait a minute. Diana.
Oh, what?
There
is. But yeah, so this is part of the show. It's called Pairings, where we talk about past episodes. But we've never had an episode dedicated to this particular topic. So I don't have
short.
I can't tell you about that,
pairings.
But I can tell you it's possible that you stumbled upon this episode because you're looking for dual diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can tell you about other episodes that we have in the back catalog that were dual diagnosis ones. And so those include episodes 16 and 209, where we talk about ADHD. Episode 156, we talked about traumatic brain injury with Dr. Meg Heineke. Episode 56, and then episode 227, we talked about behavioral gerontology with Dr. Miranda Trahan and Amanda Ripley. Episode 231, we talked about EBDB. Is that right?
Emotional behavioral.
I think I might have gotten too many B's in there. EBD, intervention with Dr. Joanna Staubitz. And then also, this one's not dual diagnosis, but we talked about early intervention a good amount in here. Episode 84, we review early intervention, EIBI. There we go. Sorry. That's the plan. Usually I recommend a snack to go with this episode, but
I'm hungry.
I didn't write anything down. So
I have a good snack.
I'm up for hearing
Jackie,
suggestions.
what's the snack?
So our snack is going to be popcorn and an icy.
Are you going to the movies?
No, but these are things we share together.
Okay.
We share an icy together?
I mean, yeah, I share ices.
I guess, yeah. I don't.
That's lovely.
I gotta buy my kids 2 ices. Get lost,
Right.
kids.
Let's go to
Or if I buy them 2, they're sharing them with me.
movies.
Then I get a
You
full
would also
icy.
eat those. You would also eat those going to the movies. But I was thinking of something that we might share.
Gotcha.
All right.
All right.
And that was pairings. Please enjoy.
It's in the notes. So officially, that is the snack of this episode. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our episode on Down syndrome and ABA. Thanks again to Dr. Kathleen Feeley for coming on the show. If you like this episode and want to hear more, maybe start with those pairings, or just go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can see all of the episodes we've done. Or, hey, just put us into your favorite podcast player and you'll immediately get access to tons and tons and tons of episodes, over 300 episodes on a variety of topics related to behavior analysis. If you're interested in getting even more content ahead of time, you can join us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe at any level. But if you subscribe at the $5 tier, you're able to get access to our votes for listener choice episodes and get access to those episodes once a season for no additional charge. Sorry, to the CEs for those episodes. And if you're like, I love this podcast, but what if books in 2 hours long? Well, you can subscribe at the $10 and up level to get access to our quarterly book club episodes. We are just about to release, actually, I think we will have released the Anxious Generation book club when you're hearing this. So if you are on the Patreon at that level, you'll get access to that right away. Let's assume it's 2 hours. We haven't recorded it yet. And 2 CEs for listening to that. Might be more than 2 hours. Diana wants to add a movie review in there. She just told us today. So it's going to be 17 hours, but you get 2 CEs because it's 15 hours of nonsense, 2 hours of hot content. And so that's the only way to get that now. Otherwise, you got to wait till we release it on the free feed next year. So again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track.
Nonsense content. It's called non-tent.
Non-tent. Yeah, we try to keep the ratio of content to non-tent higher on the content side of things. And of course, you can email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com if, like some of the Regis students, you have an episode you'd love to hear some more about. Some final thanks. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturia for interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. Before we wrap up, though, second secret code word from Dr. Kathleen Feeley. It is sinus, SINUS, because sinuses can lead to issues with health and illness, which go into some of the motivating operations that you're going to need to take into account when working with children with Down syndrome. So it's a code word and also a reminder for y'all out there. All right. Well, we'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.